And it looks like it is working. All right. We'll give it just another minute so people can log in if they are waiting on the YouTube or to come through Zoom. Just a reminder that this is the second part of our last discussion, which was 2 weeks ago about Kashrut. That doesn't mean you have to watch them in order. I talked a lot more about why we keep kosher last time. And so if you're looking for that, that's a great place to dive in. But we are talking about different types of subjects, different focus this week. So if you haven't watched last week, it's okay. You can still keep watching. Just go back and watch the other video at some other time. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So thank you to everybody for joining me tonight. And thank you also for your understanding that we didn't have class last week. I really appreciate your patience. My family was observing Shiva, and that's part of our community and life and the topic that we will cover eventually together. But for tonight, we're continuing our discussion of Kashrut. Now, you may remember that last time we talked about the meat and milk issue. That is to say, we looked at some pictures of meat and we looked at some pictures of poultry. And as we discussed, since we don't eat meat, meaning mammal, together with milk, we also don't eat poultry together with milk. And I explained the reasons and origins for that. But I didn't go over why we don't eat milk and meat, mammal meat in the first place. Where did we get the idea that we are not allowed to eat, to mix the milk of an animal together with the meat of the animal? Well, we got that idea from the Torah, obviously, but we get it from 3 different parts of the Torah, where it says, you shall not boil a kid here meaning baby goat, in its mother's milk. That's just one of the joys of English. The word kid can mean both a human child or a baby goat, because English is fun. And that gets mentioned in both, or rather in all the places here listed, Deuteronomy, as well as twice in different parts of Exodus. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so this is only prohibiting the use of a baby goat milk or baby goat meat together with that exact goat's mother's milk. Well, as the Shulchan Aruch explains, the word kid, this baby goat, is not specific. It is the same rule with ox, sheep, and goat, or indeed any of the kosher mammals. There is no difference if it is the milk of the mother or of another domesticated animal. Rather, the verse refers to the common case. So this is a very normal situation. The laws of personal injury come in a section of the Torah that deals also with people that are indentured servants. That doesn't mean that personal injury is primarily about indentured servants. It means that it was talking about a particular situation that might be more common, meaning people might think it was okay to injure their servants, when of course it isn't. And so too, the Torah is describing what was apparently a common practice in the ancient world, which was to use the meat of a baby that was not considered useful for your flock, and to cook it together with the milk from the mother, of course, that would have just produced that baby. But the terms kid and mother's milk are not meant to be limited only to that particular child and that particular mother. Instead, it means any meat together with any milk that is coming from kosher animals is off limits to mix. Now, that caveat about them being from kosher animals is important, because unlike the other forms of kashrut that we have discussed so far, this prohibition is not only about not eating. As it gets explained, the house of Rabbi Eliezer taught, the Torah states, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk 3 times. Why 3 times? 1 time to teach us the prohibition of eating, 2nd time to teach us the prohibition of deriving benefit, and the 3rd time to teach us the prohibition of cooking. It's important to note as one of those things to file away that Judaism does not think the Torah is redundant. If the Torah repeats what looks like the exact same commandment in multiple places, then each time it comes to teach us something new, maybe an aspect of the commandment, or maybe a different dimension of it, or some other interpretation. In this particular case, we believe that the 3 different times it comes is to show us don't eat it, don't benefit from it, don't even cook it. And that means that we have to be very careful when it comes to mixing meat and milk. But it also means that the rabbis taught us that it only violates these issues when it is from a kosher animal for both the meat and the milk. So technically, if somebody wanted to work in McDonald's, they wouldn't be allowed to eat the cheeseburger, or indeed the regular burger, since the meat is not properly slaughtered. But they would be allowed to make the hamburger and to even put the cheese on it, because they are not actually kosher meat, although it is probably kosher milk. So it doesn't violate this prohibition. However, if you have a piece of kosher meat and a piece of kosher cheese, and you put them together, now you have violated this commandment. And all the more so if you eat it. And of course, if you sell it to someone else, that is also a problem. Excuse me, just give me a second. So this is a big deal. Unlike the other issues of Kashrut, a Jew could technically be allowed to buy and sell pigs, not eat them, but they cannot buy and sell this mixture of kosher meat and kosher milk. And needless to say, if it's not kosher, then you wouldn't be eating it under normal circumstances either. All right, let's hope that's clear, because this principle of not mixing meat and milk becomes a germ, if you will, a seed that will sprout into many other effects when keeping your kosher life, and especially your kosher kitchen. Because if we are not allowed to cook things together, can we cook them one after the other, sequentially? Well, probably not. And we get that idea here from the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. As it says, only the gold, the silver, the copper, the iron, the tin, and the lead, whatever is used in fire, you shall pass through fire, and then it will be clean. It must, however, also be cleansed with sprinkling water, and whatever is not used in fire, you shall pass through water. So this is the general statement in Bamidbar of what we do if we have a pot, a pan, a knife that it has been used by someone for non-kosher cooking. In this particular case, it is from people that attacked us that we are now claiming after the fight. If you have something that has been used in non-kosher cooking, what do you do with it? Well, if it is made from gold, silver, copper, iron, or tin or lead, and if it is the kind of thing that you use in fire, think like a barbecue grill or a spit that you might roast your chicken on, not that they had chicken back then, but hopefully you get the idea, then you have to not only sprinkle it with the water, what we would consider taking it to the mikveh, but you also have to put it in fire, meaning that if it was a spit that you used for your, let's call it roast duck, then you have to take that spit and also put it into fire before it can be used for kosher food. If it doesn't get used in fire, meaning if it's not being used like that, but it's just the kind of thing that maybe you serve it on, like a plate, then you don't have to pass it through fire, but you do need to pass it through the water. Now, what this means in practice will be outlined, but you'll find out the general rule as we go through. And the general rule is that some materials are easier to make new again. That is to say, some things can be Kashrut. This is a great English mutilation of the Hebrew word kasher, meaning to make something kosher, and putting it into a verb form. So things like clay pots or plates can never be rekoshered. They can never be turned into a new substance again. Once you have used your clay pot for something that wasn't kosher, whether it be pork or whether it be a mixture of meat and milk, it's done. It's gone. Never get to change that again. It is now permanently not kosher. However, that is only for earthenware type vessels. If it is made from glass, on the other hand, it can be rekoshered simply by washing. Because glass is impermeable, it cannot be penetrated by the substances. Therefore, it doesn't absorb them. Therefore, we don't have to worry about it releasing them under the heat of cooking into whatever we are cooking next. So with glass, you just have to wash and make sure they're clean and no longer have residue from whatever other substance was put in them. Where we get into more interesting cases are metal, wood, stone, and heat-resistant plastics that can be rekoshered, but they get rekoshered according to specific rules. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated, but still not that hard. Because you see, there's a general rule that is not too hard for us to keep in mind. One is that if you want to rekosher something, well, you have to clean it, right? You have to make sure that there are no obvious signs of food still sticking to the pot, still sticking to the plate, still sticking to the knife, right? So you finish cooking. Let's say, for example, our issue is we have a knife and we just cut a piece of meat, and then we suddenly realize, lo and behold, we accidentally bought a non-kosher piece of meat. We weren't reading the label clearly, whatever happened, right? You made a mistake. So now my knife has gone through a hot piece of meat. That's going to be important later. And so I'm worried my knife has become not kosher. All right, I throw away the non-kosher meat, of course, and I now take that knife and I give it a good wash and make sure there's nothing still sticking to it. Good. I take the knife and I leave it for 24 hours. Now, the process of leaving it for 24 hours is, as our sages teach us, to ensure that anything that has been absorbed by it has now become spoiled. That more than 24 hours after having been cooked, we are not going to consider anything that it releases, which will happen in just a second, as being of benefit to whatever it comes into contact with. Instead, it will be, well, yuck. And as yuck, we don't need to consider it as being food anymore. And that means that we need to force it to release it. And we do so by subjecting the item to the appropriate form of koshering, which we're going to talk about in just the next page. Now, what this also means that if I have an item that has never been used to cook food, and it's never come into contact even with sharp food, meaning things like onions that have a particular acidity that might bite into the material, then it has never absorbed flavors. So if you are at the supermarket and you want to buy yourself a brand new glass off the shelf, perfectly fine, go ahead and use it. It's brand new. No one has ever been using that before. It's ready to go. Take it home, take off the label, take it out of the package, and you're good to use. But if you go to a secondhand store to buy a glass or to buy a plate, that's where all of these specific rules are going to come into play. I should also point out that this issue of koshering is not only for secondhand plates, or if somebody has not been keeping kosher for their whole life and now they wish to start keeping kosher, but this also has to do with when you are preparing for Passover, because at Pesach, we also want to wipe the slate clean in order to prepare for Pesach, so that any of the chametz, the leavening that has been absorbed, will be not a problem during the holiday. And we will go into much more detail about that later on. But it's also useful if you have made a mistake. For example, if you use a spoon to mix a hot meat soup, and that spoon is normally a dairy spoon, then we need to deal with the repercussions. So it's not just for a few situations. It could come up from time to time in every house. Indeed, almost every year if you are preparing for Passover. All right, so here is the general rule, the easy way to remember it. Kivolo kach polto. What that means is, in the more clunky English, Rav Huna, son of Rabbi Yoshua, said, a wooden ladle shall be purged in boiling water in a primary vessel. Why? He holds, as it absorbs, so it ejects, right? As it sucks in, so it gets out, meaning however you use it, especially however you applied the heat to the object, that is the way that you apply heat to make it get rid of whatever it had absorbed. Again, this is after having cleaned it already and waited 24 hours. Now we are subjecting it to heat in a particular way to make it, well, quite literally vomit whatever it had absorbed that we want to get rid of. And that means that we need to have different techniques depending upon the way different items are used. Let's go through them. So the first and the most common is known as hagala. Now, hagala is what we do when we have things like a stovetop, like your pot, your stovetop, you boil water in it, or our cooking or serving utensils, the spoon that you're stirring your soup with, the knives that you use to cut your hot food with, your forks, your spoons that you're using to eat the hot food with. All of those items are taken care of in this manner. You take a kosher pot or a new pot, because that is by default kosher. You fill it with water. You bring it to a roiling boil, meaning not just a few bubbles, but really the whole thing looks like the big jacuzzi. And then you put the item into the pot for a short time, say about 10 seconds or so. And if the object is too big to go completely underwater all at once, you can do the different parts of the object in the pot as long as the hot boiling water reaches every corner of whatever it is you're trying to kosher. Now, that is the basic rule. However, objects that have parts that cannot be reached to be cleaned can often not be koshered. That is to say, if there are very deep cracks, very crevices, if there are crimped metal edges that have some openings, but you're not sure you can get all the way around and in it, then in many cases, those objects cannot be rekoshered because there's no way to ensure that this hot water has reached everywhere, causing it to expel whatever it had absorbed that made it not kosher in the first place. So you can always check with your rabbi, that's me, if you have something that you need to be rekoshered and you need an opinion and a ruling on its status. But for most things, like your basic fork and knife, this process works perfectly fine. All right. Libun is a more involved process, and libun is needed for anything that comes into fire, into direct contact with fire. Oops, hello. Nope, go back. Into direct fire by itself. So for example, an oven, a grill, baking trays, things that are often used in fire directly, especially if you have a gas stove or if you're using a grill in your backyard, your barbecue, then in order to kosher them, we need libun. Again, still has to be cleaned, still has to be left for 24 hours, but once that time period is up, now we get to the heat process, and we have to use a blowtorch that makes the metal hot enough to glow, right? That is necessary for anything that comes directly into the fire. Now, if it is something that doesn't come directly into the fire, then we can use what's known as libun kal, a more gentle form of libun, right? Things like grills, roasting spits, stuff that's actually over the flames, that we need the blowtorch. But other things like the baking trays or the oven itself, that can be made kosher by bringing it up to more than 550 degrees and leaving it for an hour so that everything will be heated up. Or most modern ovens also have a self-cleaning setting, and the self-cleaning setting will also work because it raises the oven up to a super high temperature, which causes everything that it might have absorbed to be expelled. So that is the general practice for libun. And if you're not used to using a blowtorch, don't. This is not something that should be done casually. This is something that needs to be done very carefully. Again, if you have questions, please contact your rabbi for advice and a ruling on this. But definitely using a naked flame blowtorch is not something for the uninitiated. So please, please, please do not hurt yourself or damage anything else around you. All right. The other way that we can apply heat for things that don't come into direct contact with a cooking surface, such as countertops or sinks, is called irui, and that involves pouring boiling water over the top of them. Again, be very, very careful. It may not be as scary as a blowtorch, but boiling water can really, really hurt you. So make sure that you do this with the utmost caution, and if you need further advice, contact your rabbi. That's why I'm here. But this is to be used for things that don't come into contact with the actual cooking process itself. So we don't cook on our countertop, we don't cook in our sink, but they do come into contact often with hot items and food, and so they do need to be koshered, and we do so by applying this wash of boiling water over them. Any questions or comments? Okay. Now, how does the contamination happen? Right. Of course, my initial example of, you're cutting the roast that you're cooking with a knife, and unfortunately, it turns out you bought the wrong pack of meat. Sure, that's obvious. It's also incredibly rare. The more common forms of problems that will force you to need to consider re-koshering things would be Passover, which we'll talk about in a future class, or in an accidental mixture between meat and milk. Now, many people will prevent this mixture by staging their kitchen in a way that such accidental mixing is very, very unlikely. For example, in my kitchen, we have one set of plates for meat, one set of plates for dairy. We have one set of cooking utensils for meat and one set of cooking utensils for dairy, and they are kept apart. They are kept separately in different containers, drawers, shelves, etc. That way, there's really no accidental way I could reach into the meat drawer and pull out a knife, which also look different than my dairy knives, and use them to cut the lasagna. It would be a extraordinarily bizarre set of circumstances for that to happen. But it could. And as such, we need to know what to do if a mistake happens. And that's what we're looking at, a very short selection of some of the what ifs on this page, which comes from Rambam's Mishnah Torah. So here's how he explains it in fairly straightforward language. It is only when the meat and milk become mixed together through cooking that they both become forbidden. That is, when a hot object fell into a hot object, or when a cold object fell into a hot object, right? So that is the basic criteria, is in order for there to be contamination, in order for there to be absorption, there has to have been heat. You have to have activated the substances, whether it be the food or the pot or the spoon, with the heat in order to open it up to then absorb. If everything is cold, that isn't possible. That doesn't mean that you casually cut your cheese with your nice meat knife. We still do not do that because we don't want to get into the habit, and we don't want to risk perhaps some piece of the cheese getting stuck in the knife that we didn't notice. But we also have to admit and recognize that if you use your cold meat knife to cut your cold cheese, you have not created the same situation as if you use your hot knife to cut your hot lasagna. So bear in mind that it is only when heat is being applied that we need to be especially careful. So if, however, what is hot fell into the other when it is cold, right? So we have, for example, let's say we have a hot meatball, and I pull out the hot meatball and I drop the meatball onto a piece of cheese, onto some dairy product. Not that I should have them both out in my kitchen simultaneously, but let's imagine I did. that hot meatball falls onto the cheese, and the cheese, of course, is cold. What do? I remove the surface of the meat which touched the milk, the dairy product, right? I cut off that part of the meatball that came into contact, and the remainder of that meatball can be eaten. Now, the cheese most likely is also going to be ruined, but the meat would be preserved in this case, except for the part that came into contact, because it was only where the hot touched the cold that the hot created a problem in the cold, which allowed for there to be a transfer. But the hot onto the cold doesn't infect the entirety of the hot object. So we could salvage most of the meat in that particular example. Likewise, if cold fell into cold, one must wash the piece of meat thoroughly, and it may be eaten. Again, imagine you have a bowl of milk out for, actually, I think cats aren't supposed to drink bowls of milk, they say these days, but imagine you had a bowl of milk out because you were preparing it for some other dish, and you accidentally dropped a piece of meat, like a little piece of steak, into that bowl of milk. Plunk, right, not good, but the meat was cold and the milk was cold. You take the meat out, you rinse off the meat, and the meat is okay. You can go ahead and still use that meat. The milk you're going to get rid of, but that meat you would still be able to use. For this reason, he explains, it is permitted for meat and milk to be carried together in a single wrap, if they do not touch each other. If they do touch, meaning if you have a bare piece of meat and a bare piece of cheese, both cold, you put them together and they're in your backpack, if they come together, then you have to wash the meat and wash the cheese. But since they are cold in their contact, both of them, there isn't a problem. It's better, of course, to wrap both of them so they don't come into contact. This is why, for example, you don't need a separate freezer or a separate refrigerator for storage of your food. You're welcome to have your ice cream in one part of the freezer and your roast in the other part of the freezer. Both of them are wrapped. Neither of them are in contact with each other. And even if they did come into contact, naked ice cream and naked meat, you would just have to wash them in order to render them fit for consumption. Most people usually end up just making sections in their freezers or their refrigerator so that it's easy to identify what is meat and what isn't. And of course, you have to be especially careful with leftovers, which aren't in their original packaging. And you want to make sure that you are using meat or dairy containers for those, absolutely, especially if you are reheating them in those containers. All right, that was a lot of information, hopefully for situations which very rarely come up, but it is important to understand what to do in this case. And if you don't remember, ask. That's always going to be my answer to any of this. If you're not sure, ask. You don't have to always be strict. Ask. Oftentimes the food is still salvageable. Sometimes it isn't. The only way you'll know is by studying, learning, and when in doubt, asking. So those mix-ups, like I said, are possible. So we do need to do a little bit of what ifs for our real world, right? Because honestly, again, most of us are not carrying around loose bits of meat over the top of loose bits of cheese. So in our real world, we don't need to panic if there is a problem. We need to think carefully and then understand the solution. So scenario number one, you have your meat stew and you accidentally stir it using a dairy spoon, but this is a dairy spoon that you haven't used in the last 24 hours. What do? Well, since it hasn't been used in the last 24 hours, as I mentioned previously, that means that anything that may have been released into the stew is not considered to be actually valid food. It is considered to be spoiled, and therefore we're not actually contaminating it with dairy, which means the stew is still okay, and you are allowed to eat the stew. The spoon, on the other hand, because you are planning to use it for dairy in the future, well, that spoon needs to be re-koshered, because otherwise it would have taken on the meat characteristic of the stew that it was in. So the stew is okay, the spoon needs to be fixed. Scenario number 2, you have meat stew and you stir it with a dairy spoon that was used recently, meaning less than 24 hours. Well, if the part that was dipped in is less than 1/60th of the volume of the soup, then the stew is okay, right? The spoon, again, has to be rekoshered. Now, if not, meaning if the spoon was quite large and the stew was quite small, and so it was more than 1/60th in contact, then indeed the stew has become contaminated, and that means that it is thrown out, and both the pot as well as the spoon has to be rekoshered. Now, that 1/60th rule is because if it is less than 1/60th of the volume of the total amount being eaten, then it is considered to be an insignificant, a trivial, an infinitesimal amount and of no actual significance. And that is why there's the 1/60th rule. Again, it is best to make sure that your practices and your kitchen are set up in a way to avoid all of these possible problems. But our ancestors were very aware that food was not something that should be thrown out just casually. For many people, it would be financially very hard and nutritionally very dangerous to just throw away food on the suspicion that maybe something went wrong. But sometimes things do become forbidden. And when forbidden, we should not hesitate to get rid of it, because in doing so, we are fulfilling the mitzvah, we are fulfilling the command. Any questions on the mix-ups? All right. Now, it's not only with regards to the act of cooking and eating directly that we have to be careful about meat and dairy. We also have to be careful about the time in between the eating of one and the other. So, as we read here from the Talmud, Rav Chisda said, one who eats meat isn't allowed to eat cheese. One who eats cheese is allowed to eat meat, meaning in sequence. If I finish my piece of cheese, I am not allowed if I finish my piece of cheese and I am sure that my mouth is empty and clear of cheese, I am allowed to go ahead and eat a piece of meat. On the other hand, if I eat a piece of meat first, I cannot immediately eat a piece of cheese. Now, the main issue here, as we're going to see, is our teeth, right? Rav Acha Bar Yosef said to Rav Chisda, the meat, this is between the teeth. What do we make of it, right? So how do we handle this whole issue about the meat in our teeth? And we referenced the verse, the meat was still between their teeth, taken from the book of Bamidbar, in our failing over asking God for meat and the abundance of quail, that we have the meat stuck in our teeth, right? And that is the issue, that when we eat meat, there is a high probability, especially in the ancient world with less dentistry, that the meat would become stuck between our teeth. And that is still a very real and actual concern. Thus, eating meat first means that when we go to eat dairy, if we did so immediately, we would exactly be eating the meat and dairy, chewing it up in our same mouth. That is where we are concerned with our mouth. How do we avoid that? Well, Mar Ukva said, in comparison to my father regarding this matter, I am vinegar, the son of wine. My father, when he ate meat, would not eat cheese until the same time the next day, meaning he waited a full 24 hours. But I, even if I won't eat it at this meal, I'll eat it at the next meal. So Mar Ukva's general principle was wait till the next meal, and then you can be sure that the meat has moved from your teeth. However, that is not the only opinion. That is still a stringency. The idea of waiting between meals, of course, also demands that we figure out how long is it between a meal. Again, taken from Shulchan Aruch, there are those that say that he doesn't have to wait 6 hours, but rather, immediately if he finishes the meal and says the concluding blessing, it is permissible after wiping and rinsing his mouth. This is found in the Tosafot, for example. The simple custom in our countries is to wait after eating meat 1 hour and to eat cheese afterwards. But you have to say the concluding blessing after the meat, because then it is like a new meal. If he finds meat between his teeth after the hour, he has to pull it out. All right, so let me just pull this out and explain it a little bit. So you will hear many people who have the custom of waiting 6 hours between eating meat and then eating dairy. And that is a fine custom, very common. And if it is part of your family's tradition and community, please continue to observe it. There are some also that have a 3-hour custom, although the origin of that custom is a little hard to ascertain. However, as Shulchan Aruch points out, there are also many customs, many countries that have the custom of waiting just 1 hour between the meat and eating dairy. But of course, making sure that you have a blessing, the Birkat HaMazon, to finish that meal before the next meal, before the meat, so that before the cheese, so that it is a separate meal. And in any event, if you still have actual meat between your teeth, you have to remove it. You can't rely on 6, 3, or 1 hours and let the meat still stay in your teeth. The meat needs to be removed, which means if you have a stubborn piece between your teeth, you're going to have to get in there and floss it if you want to go into a dairy meal at any time. Now, technically, if we want to get the minimum standard, if you have said the concluding blessings and you have wiped and cleansed your mouth, making sure that there is nothing there, technically it is possible to eat faster than that between the meat and the dairy. However, that would really be only appropriate in emergency situations. Most people will rely on 1, 3, or 6 hours as their standard custom. As it says again in Chulin from the Talmud, at the next meal I'll eat, not just at the meal that is customary, meaning 1 in the morning, 1 in the evening, rather even immediately. If you clear the table and make the concluding blessings, it is permissible, since the rabbis didn't differentiate. Again, as I mentioned from the Tosafot, they did recognize that it was possible to do this sequentially. It's just very unlikely. And I see we have a hand raised. If you can either put it in chat or unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes. I thought this had, whether you eat meat or dairy first, had something to do with the passage of thou shalt not cook something in its mother's milk. So you had to eat either the meat or one or the other first, I don't know which, so that it digested, so that the dairy was not cooked in its mother's, so that the meat was not cooked in its mother's milk.
Right, so you are 50% correct. So we definitely are separating our meat consumption from our dairy consumption precisely for that verse. Verses, because it's mentioned 3 times, of not cooking the meat in the mother's milk. However, it's not about cooking it in our stomach. Digestion is not an issue. The meat goes into your stomach, the dairy goes into your stomach, and it doesn't matter how long that's been between it for your stomach. But what does matter is how long is it in your mouth? Because if there is still the real possibility of meat hanging out between your teeth, then when you put that hot dairy into your mouth, there is a very real chance that it is now being cooked in your mouth. You are now eating them together. But we don't have to worry about our stomach. We just have to worry about what's in our mouth. That's why we don't have to count how often we go to the bathroom before we eat the meat. It's why we don't have to check when it's moved to our intestines. We don't have to worry about the size of what we eat. We just have to worry about literally the contents of our mouth, that it is not mixing there. And if we can do that, then we are following the commandment just fine. And like I said, waiting the 1, 3, or 6 hours, as the custom of your community dictates, is a very good buffer to make sure that our mouth has had proper time to get rid of the meat before we consume any dairy. But you're right. The part that was not quite right of what you said is that we don't need to worry about digestion. All right, and then one more source, for this time from the Tur, but he's quoting the Bahag, writes that one who eats meat can eat dairy immediately afterwards, as long as there is wiping and washing of the hands. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this minimum standard of wiping and washing, of clearing your mouth and making sure there's no cross-contamination immediately, is because the observance of additional stringencies on the delay in eating have become quite controversial and quite difficult for many people to swallow. And I want to make sure that people understand that if they are waiting the hour, or even if they go immediately but do it correctly, that they are complying with the core of the law. It's better to follow the customs of your community, and it is better to have a buffer, but one does not need to go to the opposite extreme of like waiting a 24-hour period in order to observe these commandments. We can take care of it and be fully within the rules of our sages and of our communities by waiting the 1, 3, or 6 hours as your community may have as its custom. All right. The other topic that I really wanted to look at today is the one that is very not so well known, but is very important. And another reason why we really do need to make sure we are buying kosher supervised beef and other types of mammals, because whatever we may imagine about a kosher animal or non-kosher animal, even a kosher animal has to have additional proper preparation before it's considered kosher for our consumption. And one of those issues is what's called the gid hanashe, or the sciatic nerve area and tissue. And why are we avoiding eating this? Well, it goes back to Jacob in the book of Genesis. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, meaning the divine creature that Jacob was wrestling with, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. That is why the children of Israel, that's us, to this day, do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, what we would call the sciatic nerve or the gid hanashe, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. So if you go back to some of my classes on YouTube about this parasha, you'll see a lot more discussion of why we don't eat this as a spiritual exercise. But for tonight, we're focusing on the technical kashrut side, and that means that we need to avoid it. But I don't want to I don't want to leave without a little bit of the spiritual side of it, of at least one explanation of why we avoid this tissue. So this is from Sefer HaChinuch. From the roots of this mitzvah are to serve as an indication to Israel that though they may suffer oppressions in the exile, being wrestled by the nations and descendants of Esav, the brother of Jacob, who was considered to be the adversary, or at least represented by the adversary that was wrestling with him, that they should trust that they will not perish, but rather that their descendants and name will stand firm forever, and that their Redeemer will come. And continually remembering this idea through the mitzvah, meaning of not eating this part of the leg, they will stand firm in their faith and righteousness forever. And this stems from the fact that the angel who fought with Yaakov, our forefather, who according to tradition was the guardian angel of Esav, wished to eliminate Yaakov from the world, he and his descendants, that means all of us, but he could not get the better of him and pained him in injuring his thigh. That was the best he could do, causing some suffering but not destruction. Likewise, Esav's descendants pain Yaakov's descendants. They've caused us problem over the centuries, but in the end, they will be saved. That's us, still around. As we find with respect to our ancestor, that the sun shone to heal him and he was saved from pain, so will the Son of the Messiah shine, and he will heal us from our pain and redeem us speedily in our days. Amen. Now, like I said, I don't want to go into too much detail about the spirituality of keeping this mitzvah, but just recognize that when you are picking up a kosher piece of meat as opposed to non-kosher, even if it's from a kosher animal, that you are making a statement of faith that we will stand firm, that we will be able to continue to exist, that we will overcome whatever suffering we are going through, that the sun will eventually shine upon us of full redemption. And that's a lot that we are able to build into a simple act as buying something at the supermarket. But that's really one of the blessings of keeping kosher, is that it gives us so many opportunities for these spiritual insights during our routine activities, because Judaism transforms the routine into the sacred and beautiful. Another essential aspect of kosher butchering is the removal of what we call the forbidden fats. As it says in Leviticus, speak to the Israelite people thus, you shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goat. Fat from animals that died or were torn by beasts may be put to any use. They could use it for burning things, but you must not eat it. If anyone eats the fat of animals from which offerings by fire may be made to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off from his kin. So there is a specific portion of the fat in the abdomen of these animals that was offered onto the altar of Jerusalem, and that means that it doesn't get offered on our plate for dinner. So those fats are removed from the animal when it is being butchered. And to this day, we still don't eat that section, which is why we get our lovely cut of meat dissection when you are going to your kosher supermarket or supermarket where kosher meat can be found. You are generally going to find kosher meat from the front half of the animal, because the back half, between the issue of the gid hanashe, the sciatic nerve, and the issue of the belly fat, is often considered more trouble than it's worth for the kosher butcher to create, to separate and butcher and then sell. Instead, what they usually do is cut the animal in half, after it's been slaughtered correctly, of course, and then sell the back half to a non-kosher slaughterer who is allowed to eat those portions because they are not bound by our commandments. And then we will serve up the front half of the animal as our meat. Now, in many Sephardic communities historically, they would go through the more laborious butchering process and remove the gid hanashe as well as the forbidden fats of the second half and prepare the whole animal for us. That was because they found that their non-Jewish neighbors were not willing to buy the back half that we were getting rid of, since they were suspicious of why we didn't want to eat that part of the animal. Finding no ready customers, that meant they had to go through the effort of salvaging all of the animal as possible, even though it was more work. But that's why you're not going to find round sirloin, loin, and flank in most kosher butchers, simply because it's not worth their effort to prepare the animal and serve us those sections. But as a big fan of brisket, I'm glad that we at least have that. And finally, I just want to leave you with a good reminder that it may look complicated. It may seem like there's a lot to remember, and there is, and we should be mindful of all of this when we are eating in order that we can properly experience the spiritual uplift and growth through keeping kosher and maintaining a kosher life. But you can rely on many organizations that have done a lot of the work for us. These are hechshers, the symbols from different communities, like we talked about last time, that have gone through the trouble of inspecting the butcher, inspecting the factory, inspecting the restaurant, or inspecting other food production to make sure that everything that is being done is kosher. When you see these symbols, it means that you can rely on the process that has unfolded to bring it to your supermarket. And you'll find that if you go to a supermarket, 80% of the dry goods will have one of these symbols or some of the other more common ones. If you're not sure, snap a picture, send it to me by WhatsApp or text or email, and I'll be happy to give you a double check on it. And most things that we like in the modern world can easily be found in kosher varieties. The exception, of course, are the meats. Both animals, mammals, birds, and as well as seafood, we have to be more careful with. But that is as it should be. Although Judaism does not demand that we be vegetarians, Judaism does expect that we will be careful and conscious of animals when we are taking them and turning them into our food. We have permission to do so if we handle it correctly and appropriately. If we don't, then we are violating a commandment. Again, thankfully, Orlando has had a growth in the availability of kosher meat. And so it's not too hard to find most of what you might like. You may not be able to find a hamburger in a restaurant, except for a couple places in town, but we are still able to find good kosher ground beef for home. And honestly, a hamburger you make on your own kosher grill is going to taste better in the long run anyway. Any questions or comments before we wrap it up for tonight?
I would like to ask a question, but not associated with this.
Please go ahead. If I can, I'll answer tonight. If not, I'll set aside time for the future.
I missed part of your sermon on Saturday, December 25th, and
Yes.
I'm wondering if it is on YouTube.
I believe I have uploaded that one. I got a little behind on some of my uploads, but the sermon from that was last week.
Yes.
The one on anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Yes, that one I'm almost positive I did upload yesterday. I think I want to say maybe Monday, but it was very, very recently this week.
Okay, because I had looked for it before that and didn't see it. So
yes, it usually takes me a few days or longer if I've been busy with other things. I really hate video editing. It usually takes a few days, if not a little bit longer, before the videos get uploaded.
Thank you.
Not at all. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoy. It's not quite the right word for discussing anti-Semitism, but that you find it meaningful and helpful.
And informative.
I certainly hope so. All right. Well, if that's all, then take care, everyone. And I hope to see you all next week. And I hope you all have a wonderful secular New Year.
I hope you have a wonderful New Year too and your family.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.